here for David Hanrahan, who's the author of 3 books now, Downsized with Extreme Prejudice, A Deadly Recollection, and Sanctuary, A Catalyst for Murder. He's here to discuss this popular detective series. His main character is Boston private investigator Bill Coyne.
Bill Coyne.
All right. Who's a retired Massachusetts State Police detective lieutenant who comes out of retirement to solve a wide array of crimes. So Hanrahan is an Army veteran, and he's a distinguished Boston trial attorney who uses his experiences and knowledge of the law in his popular mystery novels. So all 20 of us or so, let's give a big round of applause to Dave. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
There, I didn't have to introduce myself like that. Can everybody now hear me? He mentioned that I was a trial lawyer in the city of Boston, and the answer to that is definitely yes, 53 years worth. And I've tried everything from murder, defending murderers, all the way up to, and I'm sorry to say if there's a doctor here, med-mal. You name it, in over 53 years, I tried it. What I'd like to do is, because I firmly believe, having now written the 3 books, that a lot of who the author is and what formed him or her comes out in the novels. I won't tell you what parts, but collectively, as I am creating characters and inventing dialogue, who I was, what I've done in my life does show up. And so let me just begin by suggesting that Dave Hanrahan, 53 years a trial lawyer, grew up in Brooklyn, New York, never once, not for a second, ever thought of being a lawyer. I was born to 2 hardworking, poor parents. My father loaded trucks in a warehouse for Bohack. It was a competitor of A&P. I don't even know if anybody remembers those things. My mother was a counter waitress at Woolworth's, and we lived in a 4-room cold water flat. Now let me explain that briefly. 4 rooms you can understand. Cold water flat you can understand. What you can't understand is we were on the top floor in a tenement in Brooklyn, and in July and August, when the sun heated up that tar roof, I believed that global warming started in that apartment. Anyway, the cold water meant there was 1 faucet in the sink, and cold water came out of it. And that's the way it was until I was 16, when, for $24 a month, by golly, they put hot water in. And all it was now we had 2 faucets and a hot water tank. The one thing we never did get, and I lived in that apartment until I was done with college, was a shower or a bathtub. My bathroom was a little bit bigger than a phone booth, and whenever friends of mine, once I got to high school and beyond, and I was now meeting people who lived in affluent conditions, whenever they went to go to the bathroom in my apartment, I would say, "Don't get lost in there." So I grew up being defensive about poverty, and one thing was sure when I got to be 22 and I left college, and I finally got out, is that I was going to light the fuse and keep on going and not go back. And if I went back, at least I wouldn't be loading trucks with my dad. And by the way, my father was uneducated, but he read every paper there was. He read the Brooklyn Eagle, the New York News, and the Journal American. He was very knowledgeable, and he used to write poetry. He drank a little bit too much, but he worked hard for it. Now, let me explain to you what happens between well, I'm going to go back one quick second. There was one thing that happened in my life that really made a change, and it got me a lot of money because I was always looking for a summer job. And I was 16, my girlfriend was 16, her mother was an elevator operator and the shop steward for the Building Service Employees Union. So they had a Christmas party, I was invited, and the president of the union showed up. And he was one of these guys that was talking loud and very friendly. And when I was introduced to him, he puts his arm on my shoulder and he said, "Young man, how would you like to be an elevator operator?" That sounded pretty cool. I'm 16. The next March, I was going to be 17. So he says, "Come see me when you're ready for a summer job." I show up. I tell the secretary, "Please tell Mr. Denker, Dave Hanrahan is here." And I see her go in, and I hear a loud voice say, "Who? Who?" So I go in, and there's Mr. Danker trying to remember, who am I? And I said, I met you at Mrs. Bonji's party. He goes, "Oh, yeah." I said, "You said I could be an elevator operator." He said, "By the way, I'm 83 now. When I was 17, I looked 14. And he's looking at this skinny kid from Brooklyn. He said, "How the hell old are you?" I said, "I am 17. He said, "Oh my God, you got to be 18 to be an elevator operator in New York." He says, "Okay, all right." He had his lunch in a brown bag. This is the God's honest truth. He tears off a piece of the bag, and he writes, "This man is okay, Charlie Danker." And he sends me to a loft building in Greenwich Village. Okay. It was horrible. The elevator, this was not automatic. When you stopped it, it slid about 3 or 4 feet. So the first thing I had to do is, when do I stop it to make it level? So let me get to the point. Nobody tells me that in this 12-story building, if you get to go past 10 anytime, you have to put it in slow. Because, like everything else wrong with the elevator, the counterweight was too big. Nobody told me. So the top floors, 11 and 12, are storage areas, and I'm there about a week, and finally the bell rings on 12. Okay? I get to 10, and I realize I know what acceleration feels like. And I finally put the old stop on, and it doesn't stop. And the thing goes up and crashes into the superstructure at the top of the elevator. And a whole bunch of dirt and rust comes down. And I'm saying, "Oh my God," I'm visualizing the cable unraveling. And so I try to stay calm, and no cell phones in those days, but everybody heard the crash. It took about 6 hours for them to get the elevator down, okay? So I end up with my eye being washed out at the hospital and a patch on my left eye. Now that's important, because now I have no peripheral vision to the left. And one of the things wrong with the elevator, in addition to the counterweight, is when you close the gate, if it didn't close all the way, there should be an emergency stop. Wasn't working. So a lady gets on, she was in her 50s, it's summertime, she's wearing a light cotton dress, and at the middle was this elastic band around the middle. And so I close the gate, it bounces open, and I don't know it. She's standing right in front of the space, and we start going down, and I hear her screaming, "Ah!" And I look, her dress had gone out into the elevator shaft, got caught on one of the door guides, and it's ripping her dress as she's turning to make sure it didn't pull her up. Fortunately, it was a light cotton dress, and it had this band around the middle, so her whole bottom of the dress ends up the shaft, and I've got this lady in her underwear screaming her head off. And the only thing I'm 17, I'm thinking, I'm going to end up in jail. This is terrible. So I bring her back up to the floor, and everybody's waiting for her, and I don't even know what I said, except I told them, I said, something happened, her dress is in the elevator shaft. So I had to write a report of the crash the day before and the poor lady losing her dress. I didn't get fired. Anyway, I'm in college, and I meet my dear wife, Charlotte. And just a quick story about her, because she's important here. Her father was dead set against her coming to New York to go to college. Her mother wanted her to go to college in New York because one of the best art schools, Pratt Institute, was in New York. I was in the industrial design department, and that's where I was heading. I was heading to be an industrial designer. And her father says to her, "I'll let you go to New York to college on one condition. You don't get involved with any of those Brooklyn guys." Well, we've been married for 60 years, and I did get along good with my father-in-law. So let me tell you briefly before I talk about the books. How did I become a lawyer when I went to Pratt Institute to study art and design? Simple. On June 6, 1958, I raised my hand as a second lieutenant in the regular Army of the United States, not a reservist. I was what they called a distinguished military graduate, and I was allowed to elect the same commission the West Pointers get. That's regular Army. Then it was a 3-year commitment, and the reserve officers on active duty had an ID card, which on the right had the date of the end of their service. Mine said indefinite. I served at the pleasure of the President of the United States. Now, I'm all set to go back to Pratt after my 3-year commitment. By this time, Charlotte and I are in the Panama Canal Zone. I'm training for jungle warfare. I had already earned my parachuter's wings, and now I'm getting my jungle expert patch. And I learned one thing about jungle warfare and jungle experts. Unless you're a monkey, you're not a jungle expert. So our 3 years are up. Charlotte's starting to pack. And guess what happens? Somebody builds the Berlin Wall, 1961. They call up the reserves, they call up the National Guard, and Dave Hanrahan and Charlotte Hanrahan get a telegram in the mail. Officer to remain on active duty till further notice. They didn't let me out. So I send Charlotte home for some vacation. I waited 30 days, I joined her, and when I came back to my office, sitting in my mail inbox was a page that said, Court Martial, United States Army Caribbean, members of the court. 5 officers appointed the judges of the Special Court Martial. Special Defense Counsel, Lieutenant David G. Hanrahan. I'm looking at this and I'm saying, wait a minute. They were short Judge Advocate General lawyers. They didn't have enough lawyers for the number of guys that were committing crimes down there. So they would tell you, if you're a soldier, they'd say, listen, we're short lawyers. If you want a speedy trial, you can have Lieutenant Hanrahan. If they knew better, they should have said, I'll wait. By the way, I called up headquarters. Major Newberry, he called everybody boy. Major, this is Lieutenant Hanrahan, what is going on? I've just been appointed Special Defense Counsel. I'm an artist. I don't know how to defend people. Hanrahan, boy, we put 3 names in a hat and yours came up. I'm thinking, 3 names? What kind of odds are those? I mean, I wish Powerball was like that, but it wasn't. So I end up a Special Defense Counsel wondering what in heck am I going to do? I won't go into details, but my first case, I should have been sued for malpractice. The guy was guilty. Okay, most soldiers in the Army, terribly, it's unfortunate, by the time they get arrested, they're guilty. So you're defending these people and you come up with ideas. I could have defended him. Instead, I put this 18-and-a-half, 19-year-old guy on the mercy of the court. I found out they had no mercy. The poor guy was given the maximum sentence. That's 6 months at hard labor, 2/3 of his base pay forfeited, and a bad conduct discharge. So I was really feeling terrible. So I had a colonel in the Judge Advocate General Corps up the street from us. And I went to see him. I said, look, I need help. Can you outline a course of study for me so I can defend these people? I said, I take an oath. I'm going to do the best of my ability. I said, I have no ability. He outlined a course, and every night that I could, I went to Fort Amador Law Library, and I began to study how to prepare cross-examinations, how to prepare direct testimony, studying the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I'll make a long story short. By the time of my 3rd case, I was ready. And I not only lost that case, but my theory was so good that I filed an appeal and reversed the conviction. Now, that's about all a lawyer can do. That's the whole Megillah. You try the case, you lose the case, you tell the client, don't worry, we'll have a great appeal. As a result of that case, I went home to my wife, and I said, I have to be a trial lawyer. And she goes, you can do it, you can do it. I said, but I got to go to law school, we have a child. And then I got to pass the bar exam. And she kept saying I could do it. And she was right. And 60 years later, I'm still married to the gal that helped me get through law school. So much for Dave Hanrahan's background. But if you read my books, you'll see in them that when I'm dealing with people, my dialogue is realistic. I try to make sure my characters are realistic. In fact, one of the people who read my book wrote this about my first book, Downsized. Hanrahan's fictional characters appear to be so real, I was actually worried for some of them as the story unfolded. After finishing this great read, I'm still thinking about them. So I do try to create reality. In doing that, I have to tell you, some of them are rough people. These are murder mysteries. And I'm dealing with crooks, I'm dealing with gangsters, I'm dealing with people who do use tough language. So because we're being televised and it's going to go on a screen, I'm going to soften it a little bit, okay? So let me do two things. Downsized with Extreme Prejudice is my first book written and published when I was 79 years of age. So between that and now, I have 3 published, and I'm still killing people. I'm deep into my 4th book. But let me tell you about Downsized. It's called Downsized with Extreme Prejudice. And you might want to know, what does extreme prejudice mean? It's what the CIA used when they wanted to assassinate somebody. They said, eliminate this guy with extreme prejudice. I don't know why they didn't say just kill the bugger. I mean, but this is Washington, and they had a better way of saying it. So Downsized came to me when I was watching the campaigners, and Trump kept saying, all of the businesses are leaving the country, they're going overseas. And I'm looking at it, and thousands of people are being fired by entrepreneurs who want to take the benefit of having cheap labor in China or Mexico. So I thought to myself, what if there was a corrupt CEO in a big conglomerate, and the guy was acquiring businesses, firing everybody, and moving offshore? In all of that activity, might somebody get upset and want revenge? And then I thought further, and I said, well, it can't just simply being fired. So I had to come up with a very good reason for the top offices of Amalgamated Worldwide Enterprises to be downsized with extreme prejudice. I'm not going to tell you what that reason is, because it's an important part of the mystery. Because it's a mystery book, all of my books are mysteries, it's tough to read something to people because I don't want to give it away. And sometimes that can happen. So for reading to you from Downsized, I picked something that is important. The chief of the Treasury for the company is the first one to be killed. Now, you can imagine what happens to the top executives once that happens. And I don't want to tell you one piece of fact, except that there are 3 or 4 officers of this big company who think they could be next. And Sid Fulton is one of them. And Sid Fulton is at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. And Sid Fulton is scared to death. He's been assigned 2 bodyguards. Tony V, who's a big, tough, when he's not a bodyguard, he's a bouncer, one of those kind of guys. And I didn't name the other bodyguard because there were so many characters in my books that the fewer names I could use, the better. So he's just the second bodyguard, okay? And so Sid Fulton gets the bright idea, wait a minute, everybody knows where we are all the time. If you're on the internet, if you're on the company grid, my God, anybody could find me. So he wakes up the 2 bodyguards early in the morning, and he said, we're getting the hell out of here. And Tony V said, wait a minute, hey, wait. I'm getting paid to stay in this hotel. It was a plush thing on the penthouse suite. He says, let's call up the company and see if that's okay. He said, no, I don't want the killer to know we're moving. And he convinces Tony V and the other bodyguard, let's get the hell out of here and find some place. So now they're walking on the streets of San Francisco, and I don't know if anybody's been to San Francisco, but the Embarcadero is a long, long street right on the waterfront. And at one point, the base of Telegraph Hill fronts the Embarcadero. And if you haven't been to San Francisco, Telegraph Hill is this humongous hill. At the top of it is the Coit Monument, and on the other side, there's a whole bunch of motels and things. So in this scene I'm going to read to you, they're about to climb Telegraph Hill, and Tony V is not happy about it. Tony stood at the bottom of what appeared to be a stairway to the sky. He bent his neck to the limit, leaned over backwards until it hurt, and still he couldn't see where it ended. No way I'm going up all those stairs, he protested. The three disheveled men had traveled the length of California Street from the Fairmont, turned left onto Drum, walked along the Embarcadero, and were now standing at the foot of Telegraph Hill. Look, said Fulton apologetically, I'm sorry, but we're almost there. Where? Said an exasperated Tony. There are a few rooming houses off of Washington Square, just below the Coit Monument. There are bound to be some vacancies this time of year, said Tony, looking up the viciously steep hill and the endless steps. I figured the worst that could happen to me in this job was to get shot at. He removed his jacket and swung it over his right shoulder. I ain't getting paid enough to have a heart attack walking up all those stairs. Come on, Fulton cajoled. We'll take it nice and easy. Stop and rest whenever you say. We don't even have our running shoes on, complained the second bodyguard, who usually said very little, leaving most of the talking to Tony. See, that's how I get away without a name. I promise, said Fulton, we get rooms, grab a hot shower, and get me oxygen, said Tony. No, but we'll take the rest of the day off. Okay, said Tony, shaking his head slowly from side to side. He pointed his left index finger at Fulton and shook it in scolding fashion. But if I get an heart attack, I'm going to kill you myself. It's a deal, said Fulton, smiling. The three men slowly climbed, Fulton in the lead, followed closely by his two unhappy bodyguards. Look at the bright side, Fulton said, already noticeably out of breath after only a few minutes. Your job just got easier. Oh, yeah? How you figure? Asked Tony. We don't even know where we are, said Fulton. The killer will never find us. The probably tracking you with a satellite. The second bodyguard laughed. So did Tony. Very funny, said Fulton. Hey, yelled the second bodyguard. You see that sign? Fulton stopped and turned. Over there, pointing in the window, that brown house behind the trees. The sign was barely visible. Fulton had passed it by. Rooms for rent, weekly, monthly meals. And that's where, said Fulton, thought he could hide from the killer. You won't know what happened to Sid Fulton unless you get the book. Or Anyway, when I got done, and by the way, people always ask me, do you have any particular people in mind when you create a character? And not really, except for Bill Coyne. All of my characters are composites. Over the course of my life, I've done so many things, so many crazy things and silly things and military things, that I did learn a lot about human nature. So Bill Coyne is a detective that I had during a murder case I had. In 1973, a client of mine, who I had just got a very big verdict for because of an automobile accident, I had met his wife, I had met his two little kids, I had been to their house, and one morning, my phone rang, my secretary said, I'll call him by a phony name because I don't like to use names even though it's years and years ago. People sometimes know. I said, hi, Jim, what can I do for you? I thought they were going to invite me to dinner because we just won a big case. Dave, Shirley and the kids, Dave, they're dead. Terrible. I said, what happened? What happened, Jim? Was there an accident? He says, no, Dave. They were murdered, Dave. They were killed. I said, okay, take your time. What can I do for you, Jim? Dave, I've just been arrested for their murders. Now, you can imagine the shock on my part when I have a guy who I just spent a lot of time with over a 2-year period, met his family, they're now dead, and he's arrested for their murder. Couldn't be. I'm a good judge of people. Right now, if somebody would tell me one of you people killed a 9-month pregnant woman, a 2-year-old girl, and a 4-year-old boy, I'd look around and say, I don't, well, maybe that could, no. I'd look around. I'd look around and say, no, they're not in here. And I learned a big lesson. Murder has no face. Anyway, being a lawyer kicked in. Jim, have you spoken to the police? Well, yes. I said, no more. It's time to keep quiet. Shut your mouth. No more talking. And I'll be right there. He was in the lockup in a small town in Massachusetts. I called my senior partner. I was just a young associate in the law firm I was at. Had not yet been a partner. And I said, George, I have to get... That would have happened to one of my victims in one of the books. I said, George, I can't go see Mrs. X, this elderly woman. By the way, I think she was younger than me. I said, I can't see this elderly woman for her will. One of my clients has just been arrested for murder. Says George, David, that woman is expecting you. You can see your client when you get done with her will. Oh my God, this is a murder case. And I got to go sit with some 75-year-old lady, pardon me, and amend her will somehow, cutting out one of her kids. So that was the fastest. I wonder if the will ever worked. It was the fastest I ever did with some elderly person. I don't think she knew it, but we got done quick. And I show up, and when I get there, my client is sitting in a room called investigation room, and he's sitting in an overstuffed wing chair, and he's looking down, and he has a handkerchief up to his face. And I went down, and I put my hands on his knees, and I said, Jim, it's Dave, I'm here. And he looks up, and there are 3 scratches that start under his ear, go all the way to the Adam's apple, and they were still weeping. That gave me a sinking feeling. I said, I want to talk to you, and I'm going to ask you outright, did you do this? No, I love Shirley and the kids. And he stuck to that story all during the case. So because there was a possibility it was a racial motive, he married a light-skinned African-American. His 2 children were young children of color. I hired a detective, and he was a retired detective lieutenant from the state police, as Bill Coyne is and was. And the guy drove me nuts. He was so audacious. I had to put a chain around his neck and say, stop, okay? Let me tell you one of the things he did. It was like 5 days after the murders, and the police and the DA had not let me into the house. So I prepared a motion to file in court to get access to the house. And he says, Dave, you represent the owner, and there are no yellow things on the house. He says, don't be a fool. Let's go see your client. So we go to the jail, and Jim is coming to the bars, and the whole time before he went to prison, his eyes are red, and he's got a handkerchief. And my detective says, Jim, do we have permission to break into your house? And he looks bewildered. He says, yeah. He says, okay. So we go to the back of the house, because it was all locked up. He breaks the window, gets it open. He says, Hanrahan, do you see anybody? I said, no. He said, there's always some lady looking out a window. And he said, the police will be here any minute. Anyway, I got to like him. And so he was the reason for Bill Coyne. And there are things that Bill Coyne does. For example, in A Deadly Recollection, He wants to see the bullet that was taken out of one of the victims, and he wants to search the guy's wallet. And he goes up to the surgical area where they would have that after the surgery. And he's got this young state police cop he's mentoring, and he says to the head nurse, "I've got permission to go in and look at the bullet." And he didn't. And the nurse believes him, and they're in there, and he looks at the bullet, and he gets some evidence, and this young cop says, "You didn't have authority." And he says, "John, if you look like you have authority, if you say you have authority, and you act like you have authority, you have authority." And I could just see my detective doing that. So anyway, in Downsized, that is Bill Coyne. So I get done with Downsized, and I'm thinking, one book doesn't an author make. Got to do a second one. And I like Bill Coyne so much, I said, why not go back and do a prequel? Bill Coyne, while he's still a detective lieutenant on the state police. And I did it. And the idea was this. Suppose a lawyer like me from Brooklyn, who now has become civilized and is a Boston lawyer, had an altercation with two young men back in Brooklyn who later become thugs and gangsters. And he unwittingly prevents them from getting something they wanted to do in Boston done. And they decide, when they realize, oh my God, this is the guy who did that to us in Brooklyn, and they decide they want to kill him. And so A Deadly Recollection isn't the mystery book where you don't know who's doing what. I introduce you to the killers. This is called the procedural, like the Columbo movies. You know who's doing it. The fun is, can Bill Coyne catch them, and how, okay? So, and by the way, just to put the context, I grew up in an all-Italian neighborhood. I was the only blonde-haired, blue-eyed Irish guy for blocks. And so I had an Irish tenor voice, and I was taking voice lessons, and I went to my voice teacher, and I said, listen, nobody listens to me in my neighborhood if I sing like an Irishman. You have to teach me to sing like Mario Lanza. She said, you could do that, but your voice won't last long. So I sold my soul to the devil. To sing like Mario Lanza, I don't care if it lasts a week. So it lasted quite a while, till maybe I was 70. But in any event, here is a scene, and I've softened up. You can tell when I get to the F word, I soften it up a little bit. These are tough guys. And my friends, some of them were like this, but they were having fun. Others quit high school, went off to become young hoodlums, getting in trouble, getting arrested, and stuff like that. And this is how they really talked. And I took a chance. In writing the dialogue, I decided I wanted the reader to think the Brooklyn accent. So talk is T-A-W-K, talk. Call is C-A-W-L, call. And brother is brother, okay? So this is a scene from A Deadly Recollection, Bullets from Brooklyn. And it takes place in Brooklyn, New York, in my old neighborhood. The phone in the small apartment on Larmer Street near Metropolitan Avenue rang about 10 times before it was answered. Yeah? Tony, it's me, Nanuch. What the hell are you doing calling here? Everybody's getting busted by the feds. All the phones are tapped, and you call? You're stupid. But it's important, really. You where you're supposed to be? Yeah. Okay, I'll call you there. And don't call me here again. Tony picked up a throwaway cell phone and dialed. The answer came quickly. Sumner Plaza Hotel, how may I direct your call? The room phone rang only once. Tony, who else can be calling you in your room 5 seconds after we just hung up? Buscata got the Jew. So you called to tell me that? No, that's nothing. Buscata's dead. Somebody killed him and dumped him in a grave in a local cemetery. It's unbelievable. What about Riley? Riley is the trial lawyer, okay? He's still walking around bigger than life. Buscata didn't get him. Tony's hot temper was now in overdrive. I want that dead. You hear me? Get the scope. I want him dead. Now, I wanted a name for a hitman. and I didn't want to use the rifleman because the guy's, I don't think he died yet. So I came up with the scope. And I'm not going to read to you how he began his life of being a hitman because it gets into too much detail. But here he is on the way to Boston to do a hit on Dan Riley. Dan Truitt, and by the way, I picked a non-Italian name, you notice that? Dan Truitt enjoyed the drive to Boston. His Mercedes-Benz sedan was capable of going much faster than the posted speeds on Route 95. However, with an arsenal hidden in various compartments, Truitt was a model driver. He was courteous in every respect and he obeyed all traffic laws. In fact, he very much enjoyed driving to work. Other drivers smiled and waved their thanks as he yielded for them. Full stops at stop signs and observation of the yellow caution light at intersections made him a rare driver. He particularly loved to help elderly people and women change a tire at roadside. Truitt was so charming on his way to a hit that he often received an invitation to dinner from unsuspecting fellow travelers who were beneficiaries of his nice side. On one occasion, he drove a retired physician and his wife for gas. They were on their way to a nephew's wedding reception in Darien, Connecticut, when their car sputtered to a stop. Truitt ended up joining them at a table number 3 and had a wonderful time. He danced with the bride and joined the bachelors for the traditional garter toss. A few hours later, Truitt blew some guy's brains out in West Hartford. Anyway, that's my scope. And by the way, because Deadly Recollection is a prequel, this book should be read first, because it's Bill Coyne when he's still in uniform, he's still a cop, and he's mentoring John Nyberg, who by the time I get to Downsized, he's on his own because Bill is retired. And Bill keeps trying to get him involved in helping him solve a case. And John Nyberg's boss, the captain who's in charge of the state police, says, God help you if you start working with Bill Coyne, okay? So anyway, A Deadly Recollection goes back in time. Now, Sanctuary. I thought about the fact that one of the divisive things that's happening in our society is the concept of sanctuary towns. I don't think there are too many people in the middle. There are people who want to have sanctuary. There are people who see it as something unfair to the average citizen. And so when I wrote Sanctuary, A Catalyst for Murder, 2 things were important to me. I don't want to give away the plot, but I wasn't going to write a book where somebody got murdered for political revenge. Okay, that would not be good. And I'm not going to tell you what the motive is because that would kill the whole book. So we have a case that begins with the chairman of the Board of Selectmen of the town of Fairlane Township. I made that up. It's in the Berkshires. When I'm going to do violence in a town like I'm doing in Sanctuary, I don't like to pick a real town because people don't like to see their towns treated like that. So Fairlane Township is legendary and fictional. And it's in the Berkshires. And I picked the Berkshires because there is so much history in the Berkshires. Shays Rebellion, I don't know if you remember that from high school. I always thought Shays was Shay possessive. No, his name was Shays, S-H-A-Y-S. And he led the revolution when soldiers coming back from the Revolutionary War weren't getting paid. And so they were losing their farms to bankers who were bringing foreclosure proceedings. And so Jonathan Tanner, a selectman who voted against Sanctuary, is the one who is suspected of killing the chairman of the board who voted for Sanctuary, okay? So Jonathan Tanner's in a lot of trouble because when the vote was passed and his town became Sanctuary, he stood up in front of everybody and he says, God help you if anybody in my family gets hurt by some illegal criminal who shouldn't be here, okay? Now, he's on record having said that. I'm not going to tell you any more except to promise you this is not a case of political revenge. So let me read a couple of things from Sanctuary. I think I'll read one thing, because this is a mystery with a surprise ending. And it is really a surprise ending when it surprises the author. I started out to have a guy be the surprise ending, because you always have this in your mind as you're writing. I made too many clues. And I figured, oh my God, some wise person, some person can say, I know who it is, and they'll jump to the back to see that they're right. So if you do want to read this book, don't jump ahead, believe me. And if you think you know who it is, you're wrong. Okay. I did a lot of research for this book. Normally, if I write about something, I've been there, okay? San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Boston, Brooklyn. And when I go to some place in my book, it's because I've been there. I think you can spot in a minute when a writer is making up something about like a place you've been and you know well, and he's trying to describe it never having been there. Now, I was not at the Battle of Bunker Hill, so I had to do research. So here is Dan Riley, the lawyer. And by the way, Dan Riley is always the lawyer in my books, okay? And he happens to be Irish from an Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn. How did I do that? Anyway, it was Dan Riley's first visit to Jonathan Tanner's magnificent home. And Jonathan Tanner now is the suspect for the murder of the chairman of the Board of Selectmen. The meeting was in Tanner's trophy room. Actually, it was more than a place to display the myriad awards given for past accomplishments. The Tanner family history from revolutionary times to the present was displayed everywhere. Tanner brought Riley over to a large glass case displaying what appeared to be very old documents. He lifted the cover and gingerly removed the handwritten letter. This letter, Attorney Riley, he announced proudly, is from my namesake, the first Jonathan Tanner, to his wife, Amity. He wrote it shortly after his participation in the Battle of Bunker Hill. His writing is not that clear. May I read it to you? Riley was amazed. Are you kidding? That thing is priceless. Please read it. Cambridge, June 18th, 1775. My dear Amity and children, I rejoice to say Providence was with me as we engaged the Brits at a place I am told is called Breed's Hill. Captain Shea's company, of which I am proud to be a lieutenant, moved us there night of the 16th. Most of us are simple farmers and spend many hours tilling the soil, but digging the dirt with which to build our redoubt was exhausting. Early on the 17th, we faced more than 1,000 men in bright red coats with bayonets affixed to muskets. I must say fear overtook me as I watched them march up the hill toward our redoubt. We held fire until we could clearly see the faces of the enemy. It was as if we could reach out and touch them before the first volley was fired. Amity, take pride in our neighbor's efforts. Twice we repulsed the enemy, only to fail on the third attack. Low on ball and powder, and with no help from other companies on Bunker Hill behind us, we fast withdrew. Though the battle was lost, it cost the Brits dearly, over 1,000 killed. Thanks to a merciful God, our losses were far less. I write this from Cambridge, and know not where we go next or when I might see you. God grant it be soon. Love to you and the children, Jonathan. Tanner smiled. Riley was speechless and moved by this incredible first-hand description of that famous battle. Tanner, may I touch it? Carefully, of course. Tanner smiled. Put out your hands, palms up. Riley followed his instruction and suddenly held a remarkable piece of history in both hands. Wow, I'm speechless, but I'm a little disappointed. Tanner frowned. About what? Your courageous ancestor didn't mention to don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. That made Tanner laugh. Leave it to a lawyer, he said, as he gingerly replaced the document in the case. We've wondered about that. And the best answer we came up with is that the day after the battle, Jonathan didn't consider that command to be historically significant. He did say they waited until they could almost touch them. By that time, I guess they could see the whites of their eyes. Riley's attention was drawn to a collection of bows and arrows on one of the walls. Are those authentic? I'll stop there. And so I did research. The Battle of Bunker Hill was fought on Breed's Hill, and the reserves that were on Bunker Hill never did show up when they were needed. But they were outnumbered, and it was smart for them to have a strategic withdrawal at that point in time. Now, writing one book, writing two books, writing three books still may not make an author, so I am 55,000 words into book number 4. And I decided to stay with controversial subjects. So titles change. I haven't got a subtitle yet, but the title of this book is called Fracking. And I deal with the use of the fracturing for gas, where they pump water down into the wells, fracture the land, and there's a tremendous controversy. The environmentalists see nothing but trouble and damage to the environment, and the people who want oil to continue to be a cheap source of power look at it as an economic boom. And so I decided there would be a large fracking company that's doing this fracking work, and they're being picketed by a whole bunch of people everywhere he has a place in his headquarters. And he's of the belief that someone's paying these people to do it. This is not just an environmental movement. There's too many people. So he suspects a big Boston law firm with offices all over the place and an office in San Antonio where this book takes place for the most part. So I'm going to read to you chapter 1, the beginning of fracking. And guess what? Not only did I use Bill Coyne, did I use my detective. In the chapter I begin with, I use my dog. We have a Shih Tzu. He's a Shih Tzu Cocker Spaniel Mick, but he's now in chapter 1. Chapter 1, Japanese Tea Garden, San Antonio, Texas. It was early morning twilight at the Japanese Tea Garden in San Antonio, Texas. To the east, just over the tree line, the sky was brightening at a steady pace. The air was heavy, foreshadowing another humid day. A gardener, whose workday would begin in just an hour, walked slowly over a quaint stone footbridge adjacent to a sunken garden pond. A school of koi meandered just below the surface, their bright colors dulled by the morning shadows. His dog, a black and white Shih Tzu, ran happily in front of him, tail wagging, looking back occasionally to make sure he was not far behind. Let me stop there. If my wife is taking my dog out and I'm not coming, he stops and he looks back and he won't go till I show up. So that's what's going on here. Their destination was a large gazebo-like structure where both would enjoy breakfast. The dog disappeared down the stone steps at the end of the bridge and began barking furiously, highly unusual behavior. Concerned, the gardener ran down the steps. The dog continued barking at something behind a thick green bush near the edge of the pond. He picked up the dog and, cradling it in his right arm, parted the top branches with his left hand. Suddenly, an arm was visible. It startled him, and he almost dropped the dog. He leaned forward and peered over the top. A ghastly sight right out of hell greeted him. The body of a man, most of it in shallow water, face up, eyes wide open in a dead man's stare. The right side of his head was crushed. Panic overwhelmed him. Gagging and resisting the urge to vomit, he ran back to the footbridge with the Shih Tzu still cradled in his right arm. He removed the cell phone from his jacket pocket and clumsily dialed 911. "You've reached the 911 operator. Please state your emergency." The gardener spoke nervously. "There's a dead guy here. It's god-awful. His head's all bashed in. It's terrible. I can hardly hear you with the dog barking. Who's dead and where are you?" "Sorry." He let the dog jump out of his grasp and continued. "I'm at the footbridge by the sunken garden in the Japanese Tea Garden. That's inside Brackenridge Park. I didn't know who's dead. He's just a dead guy to me. Please stay where you are and keep the phone on. The police are on the way." And so that's the murder that gets Bill Coyne, who's home relaxing with his wife Jeannie, who hates it when he gets involved in dangerous cases, and he gets called by the CEO of the fracking company, and he said, "These police aren't going to help me. I need you. I'm told you're the best." And so that's how Bill Coyne ends up trying to solve murders, plural, in San Antonio, Texas. With his wife, I got to tell you, one of the reviewing companies said of Sanctuary that I'm old-fashioned, that my relationship between Bill Coyne and his wife is like in another generation. She listens to him. She gets him coffee and tea and cocoa. Anybody do that anymore? I think so. And so she said that she's just a cipher. You know, she's not important. Well, she is. She's there for him, and he talks about his cases to her. So unlike Columbo, who has a wife you never meet, he comes home after a busy day and he tells his wife what the hell's going on. So in Fracking, he brings her to San Antonio with him, and he tells her, Jeannie, you're going to be my assistant in this case. And she says, oh my God, you got to be crazy. How can I be an assistant? And I'm not going to tell you. It's such a fun story, but it deals a lot. Now, you notice how I didn't use a name. It's just the gardener. Because one of the reviews of my books is they talk about how many characters I have, but they always say I handle them well. Can you explain to me how you go through life without a lot of people? Somebody gets murdered, they have a family. There's not just one policeman involved, there's several. Coyne is dealing with doctors, lawyers, and so the world is people with people, and in my books, they're there. And so is Jeannie. And Jeannie does a good job in San Antonio, and when they get back to Boston, they're in big trouble. She knows it. She warned Bill, if you take this case, big money means big danger. And she finally agrees to have a permit to carry a gun. And in the book, she's not just a cipher who makes coffee and cocoa. She's a gun-packing wife. And I want to send this book to that reviewer and say, here, you know, look what you did to Jeannie. Anyway, that's what happened once I started. I couldn't write books when I was a trial lawyer. You can ask my wife. You're never home. You're busy. After the trial, there's an appeal. After the appeal, there's a crying session if you're lost. I mean, it's a tough business. And I'm happy to say that my last complicated jury trial was when I was 78 years of age, and my client had been accused of age discrimination. Okay? And the jury comes in for my client after a 3-week trial just before Christmas. So when a jury rules for the defense just before Christmas, you feel like you've done a good job. So on the way to the elevator, all these jurors are walking, and it was an unusual, I hate that, because I'm trying the case. I'm not making contact to the jurors except when I'm talking to them as I must. And so my client says, by the way, can you imagine being accused of age discrimination? My lawyer's 78 years old. And one of the jurors said, we figured that was in the wings and might come out any minute. So I didn't kid anybody. They knew my age discriminating guy had an old lawyer for a trial lawyer. Are there any questions? We ended just 1 hour, unless the clock is fast. I have a few minutes. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
What do you do for writer's block?
I don't call it writer's block. I call it time to go back and review everything. Because it's really not a block. It's looking for another idea, okay? I consider a block something that immobilizes you. And that's it. The book's over. I'm on page 20, and I have not another idea. What I find helpful is, where do I go next? What's the next thing that I would like to see if I were the reader? And while that's percolating, I go back to the beginning, and I edit, and I read. And guess what? Going back over everything kind of puts me back in where I've been, and sometimes that really unleashes a creative idea. Like, for example, in Fracking, a couple of pages have gone by, and it wasn't exciting. It was just a lot of administrative stuff. And I said, boy, to keep the pages turning, You got to have people excited. You got to be wondering what's happening. And so I have an underwater fight between two scuba divers. And I don't know where the heck that came from, except it's a fun thing. Because have you ever tried to fight underwater? No, I mean, who the hell? I spent a lot of time underwater, but I wasn't fighting anybody, but I know what it would be like. So I didn't have to have a fight underwater. Give you an example. Both men are wearing dry suits. This is wintertime this takes place. And a dry suit is a big, bulky suit that's worn over your winter clothing. So it's very bulky. And so with water resistance and a bulky, bulky uniform, these guys, and you don't have gravity for leverage. Like you can't take a guy rushing you and use that leverage and twist him and that. Everything is like a dance. And so I have that come up in fracking. And I'm not going to tell you why, because that would give too much away. I don't know when I'll be finished, and I decided what I want to do with book 4 is Sanctuary is published by a small publishing house in New Hampshire, and I want to try to, being 83 is a problem, because publishing houses are looking for somebody that's going to do 20, 30 books over a lifetime of writing. But I'm going to try to push it and see if I can get a publishing house to take the 3 books I've done and this one and put them out, seriate them one after the other in hard copies. So that's what I'm going to try to do with Fracking. And it's a fun story. And I have people picketing outside the headquarters of Bedrock Ventures. By the way, I always research to see if I'm inventing a company, is there a company out there? And there's a Bedrock Ventures. It's a company in India. And they don't do anything with drilling. So I said, to hell with them. I mean, so it's Bedrock Ventures is the big fracking environmental destroyer.
It's where Phil Flintstone.
I'm sorry, what?
Fred Flintstone.
Fred Flintstone. Who? Oh, I don't remember that. So he's from Bedrock? I'm going to get sued.
Well, you haven't published it yet.
No, in the front of every book it says, this book is a work of fiction, all names, places, blah, 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 you know, the imagination of the author. I wish my detective in the murder case was alive to see this, because he'd get a kick out of the fact that I've got this tough, audacious guy like him. So, and by the way, a couple of policemen who read my books did tell me that they thought that getting inside the friction between a state cop and a local regular policeman, fighting over territory, a little jealous of the other. And I touch in my books that happens. One of my Coyne doesn't like a lieutenant by the name of Petruska in A Deadly Recollection. And there's one scene, I'll do it from memory, where Coyne shows up and there's a funeral. By the way, a dead body is put into an open grave that's scheduled for a burial later. I won't tell you why or how it gets there, but that's how Coyne gets into the case. He gets a call. Bill, they found a dead body in a grave in the municipal cemetery in Quincy. He goes, what the hell's wrong with that? Okay, isn't that normal? So when he shows up, the funeral party is there. And this Lieutenant Petruska, who's not a state cop, he's the local Quincy cop, he says, we got to work fast. They want to bury their guy. He says, tell them to go home. There's not going to be any funeral here. I don't know how long it's going to take. There's a murder took place in the cemetery, and we have to take the time to investigate it. He goes, I got to tell him to go home. He says, yeah, the guy picked the wrong time to die. Just tell him to go home. So Petruska tells him to go home. He sees the vehicles leaving, and Petruska comes back. He says, Coyne, she wanted to know who she could sue. I gave him your name. So that's the kind of stuff that really goes on between cops on the internet. Any policemen here? Okay. Oh. Can I have your name to put in my next book? Did you ever have any interaction with any of the state cops?
Yes, sir.
I mean, it doesn't always happen, but every once in a while it happens where somebody's a little jealous of jurisdictional issues and they get rough around the edges.
Happens a lot.
In my murder case, Bill Coyne doesn't get impressed with coincidences because they happen a lot. And so that he will not ignore facts. The facts take him where they have to go. And in my murder case, the real case, I'm arguing that certain things that look bad for my client were just a massive coincidence. And that's a tough thing to argue to a jury. Oh, yeah, it's a coincidence. It just so happens that that's a coincidence. Well, guess how this trial ended? It ended in March on St. Paddy's Day. The judge was Irish. The prosecuting attorney was Irish. The state police sergeant that was helping him was Irish. I was Irish. My assistant, John Lennon, was Irish. Everybody on that case in front of the bar was Irish on St. Paddy's Day, the end of the thing. And I said to the jury, I know many of you are thinking, a coincidence? Well, how's this for a coincidence? And I said, we're all Irish over here. And it's St. Paddy's Day. And they were all looking, oh my God, how do I get over that argument? So anyway, I'll tell you one more thing about jury contact. In my courtroom scenes, I want them exciting. So there's an awful lot of boring stuff that goes on in a case. I know how far you can push a judge before you get held in contempt. So I do that a lot to get excitement going, okay? I also put the reader at counsel table where something bad is happening in the case and one lawyer writes to the other one, my God, he's killing us. Okay, and then be quiet, the jury's looking. You know, little notes going back and forth. So in this one real trial I had, it was a big sexual harassment case against a huge insurance company. And they put an ex-Marine on the stand, and maybe I'll get into that too. And during the direct exam, when my opponent is asking his client questions, he says this, well, you know, the insurance company is a tactile business. So I write down tactile business. What the hell is that? So now it's my turn to cross-examine him. And one thing you want to do in life as well as courtroom trials, you want to change words into concepts that will help you. So I say to this guy, sir, you told the court and jury that the insurance business is a tactile business. Did you mean by that like touchy-feely? And the idiot goes, well, yeah, you could say that. I said, can you please tell us how the insurance business is touchy-feely? He goes, well, somebody sells their first $1 million policy and they come back to the office, I give them a big hug. I said, you hug the men and the women? He goes, yeah, but the trouble with the women is you never know who likes it. And I said, why don't you assume none of them do and keep your hands off? The jury almost applauded. The judge, a tough old New Englander, says, Mr. Hanrahan, that was overly dramatic. Don't do it again. Now, the trial is over. I won, and the jurors are waiting for me by the elevator bank. And it's the old federal court building. Mr. Hanrahan, the judge yelled at you for being overly dramatic. Don't stop. So I said, okay, I'll get held in contempt someday. But you got to be careful. And I'll tell you one more thing, and it's in sanctuary. During my real murder trial, this is my client. I told you I did believe his innocence, even with the scratches. And at the arraignment, and I want you to know that all the victims were suffocated manually and those big plastic bags placed over their heads, taped tightly around the neck, and adhesive tape placed over the nose and mouth area. So someone had given some real thought that maybe they'll wake up and they'll chew their way out or something. So keep in mind, suffocation, plastic bags, taped over the mouth. I'm at the arraignment, and the judge is now considering bail. and I make an argument something like this: Your Honor, I know Jim. He was a client of mine recently. I met the family. He's here with his priest and his doctor. He's not a flight risk. He's a pillar of the community. He's done this, he's done that, a whole bunch of stuff. I said, he is one person who you can place on personal recognizance. No bail. Did a good job. DA stands up, Assistant DA, John Jennings, 6'3", big guy, deep voice, deeper than mine, which is not deep. Your Honor, I'm glad Mr. Hanrahan is just a lawyer and not a judge of people. Because what would the pillar of the community be doing in a murder where plastic bags were taped over the victim's head when he was arrested? In his wallet was this list: bags, tape, ether, mask, overalls, gloves. Now, nobody told me about that. That's the first time that I saw that. That was in the Globe the next morning. This all took place in '73. And it was a shock. The result of that, I got the venue changed so that the trial would be in a jurisdiction that didn't have all of this publicity. I also got time. I had him out on bail for 2.5 years before the case went to trial. Anyway, I try to put this all in my books, and Charlotte keeps coming saying, "Are you done yet?" And oh, by the way, my daughter, who's living in Tewksbury right now, she's a doctor at the VA hospital, and I read sections to her just to get confirmation. I think she's a loving daughter. She tells me it's good. And by the way, she was born to Lieutenant Hanrahan, but when she was older, I was a captain before I got out, and she used to call me Captain Daddy, which I thought was fun. I thought that was good. Any more questions? Yes?
Was that your client? Was the client found guilty? Did they ever have a...
The client was found guilty in the first trial.
Okay.
And I got that list removed.
Okay.
I had it quashed. They never gave him his Miranda warnings. So that first trial was burdened terribly by that list. The trial judge was a brand new trial judge. By the way, the judge in that district court, when they held up that list, I jumped up, and he was a brand new district court judge. And I said, "Your Honor," all the press was starting to run out of the courtroom. This was a big trial. This was a big thing. You know, a 9-month pregnant woman and 2 babies killed, and an executive at Leechmere accused of their murders. And so there was a lot of press. And I said, "Your Honor, I want an order. I want a gag order right now. Please don't let that get published." And he says, "I don't know if I have the authority." I said, "You've got authority." I said, "That's an outrage what he just did." And that did get me, ultimately, a new trial. The second trial was a hung jury. And I got out of the case. It was killing my civil practice. And he was a guy who had a master's degree in psychology. And I told him that I was burnt out. And I said, if you let me out, I will get you somebody that I think will even be better than me because of who I have in mind. I have in mind a retired African-American judge who will be defending a white guy accused of murdering a black lady. And he thought about that, and it seemed to be a good idea, so I got off the case. He was convicted on the third trial. The second trial was a hung jury. Without that list was a killer. And the judge told me afterwards, long afterwards, he said, "Hanrahan," he said, "I knew you were right, and I should have taken that list out of the case on my first motion to quash." He said, "But I just couldn't stand the thought of a jury not getting this case with the full evidence." I said, "Yeah, Judge, but you're supposed to follow the law." He said, "I know I should have." And a lot of that goes on sometimes with when you've been an experienced trial lawyer, judges will tell you they've made a mistake or something. Anyway, well, by the way, yeah.
What do you think, what is your opinion of the situation with Jeffrey Epstein? Do you buy?
Well, I only know what I read in the papers. And any time that you have evidence that is inconsistent with a theory, like fractured hyoid bones. Shouldn't happen if you're killing yourself by leaning into the sheet, okay? Who knows whether somebody with a thin hyoid bone, I have never studied that aspect of the anatomy, but you give lawyers, you give people the slightest little bit of inconsistency, it's an air balloon by the time you're done with it. And it happened in this case, in my real murder case. 3 victims, all presumably killed at the same time, within minutes of each other. And at the autopsy, the state medical examiner, the #1 guy, files a report. And he has the 2-year-old girl's liver temperature warmer than the 9-month pregnant woman's liver temperature. That couldn't be. She had all this fat and all this liquid, and she had a fetus. And so her body would be cooling much more slowly than a little 2-year-old body. That was a mistake. But what if it's true? Guess what? They weren't all killed together. That kills the theory that somebody stayed home and did this one, this one, this one. And I pumped that up. And then I found out that this poor medical examiner, he had his wife type up his reports. And when I found that out, I embarrassed him on the stand. I said, listen, you do the autopsy, you got 3 bodies, and you're dictating to each one, and you're going, I said, did you finish one, or did you go from 1 to 1 to 1? And I have them all confused, and then I bring out the fact of his wife finally does the reports, and I get a call from the DA. He says, the medical examiner says he's going to sue you for embarrassing him. I say, hey, lots of luck. So that situation, and by the way, Baden, Dr. Baden, have you heard that name? He came up in Epstein. And he's an older guy now. He must be getting close to my age. I had, for my case, the medical examiner of the city of New York. Baden was his assistant. My guy died. He wasn't available for the 3rd trial. And Baden filled in. And I've been watching him. Baden has testified a lot during a lot of cases about time of death and things like that. And it's tough. Time of death issues are so hard. They're very difficult. The local medical examiner, not a medical examiner, the local doctor who gets called in, he was an OBGYN guy, and he gave a time of death at the scene of midnight, okay? Well, the guy, he had no thermometer. He had nothing. And by the way, the thermometers they use for postmortem exams are like that. You don't use your oral thermometer. And so when I was cross-examining him, I said, listen, you touched the feet of the dead woman, and you turned to the sergeant of the policeman and you said, these feet are very cold. These people have been dead since midnight. I said, my wife's feet are about as cold as anybody's, and she's alive.
That was a little cold.
Do you know how I know how cold her feet are? Anyway, little things like that become so important. Anyway, he was just an idiot. Anyway, any more questions? Yes?
So back to your writings, current events that go on now, do they say, like, you're writing something, oh, this sounds like I'd like to make another book about this, and then you want to, like, almost like jump to start doing something else?
I didn't hear it because of the echo.
Oh, I'm sorry. So when you're writing your books,
Yeah.
and you're writing now this one on fracking, if a current event comes up and you say, like, oh, that would make like a good, something like that would make like a good book, and you almost want to, like...
I got to be careful. That's a good question. You got to be careful. My books are now, whatever now is. If I tie into something that's current, it's then. And so when you're reading the book, you say, oh, this happened 2 years ago. It may be that long. So I'm very careful not to do a current event. Like, I forget what book, and by the way, when you write this many, I don't know how Grisham does it or how Patterson does it. They got 20, 30 books. Every once in a while, when I think about Sanctuary, I think about something that happened in the Dead of Recollection. But in one of the books, and I think it's Downsized, the attorney is talking to one of the cops, and he mentions the Celtics. I took it out because it was timely then. And by the time the book came out, somebody would have said, oh, this must have happened 2 years ago. When you're reading the book, it's got to be now. And fracking, I mean, look, all the stuff that's going on now with sanctuary. Oh, by the way, in sanctuary, I did try my best. All arguments are there. The people for sanctuary have their say. They have their signs when they're picketing. The people who are against it have their say. And the reviewing company concluded that my book, and let's see if I can find it, is a strong, if slanted, legal thriller. She thought it was slanted. And I'd like to find out from people if they think it was slanted in which way. Because it may be the reader sees one slant, and but I did try, for example, I've got the dead selectman being buried, and he's being buried in a real cemetery, and right near a very well-known plot, and there's shouting going on. And it's the protesters. And they're protesting the killing of the chairman, because they're all in favor of sanctuary. And let's face it, 2 out of 3 selectmen were in favor of sanctuary. The town obviously was in favor of sanctuary. But I think what got the reviewer upset is the police chief is called in to give a report on crime since the sanctuary laws. And the chief of police is somewhat suspect in his views, particularly when he claimed that the selectman was a suicide, not murder. And he and the local medical guy, who was also an OBGYN, like the one I had in my murder case, he's long dead. He signed the thing, suicide. And he said there was a slight uptick in crime since the sanctuary laws. And the reviewer said, if you look at the polls and look at all the history, crime goes down. Well, I researched it. Crime may go down, but within certain categories, like automobile theft and breaking and entering, within the overall crime going down, those things could go up. And that's what went up in this report. But it's a fiction. It's a work of fiction. So I like to have things get a little more exciting than just blah. So people got upset that there was a little uptick in crime. So anyway, yes?
How about an idea for a book? A young man from Brooklyn attacks people in elevators.
No. He attacks them at an author event in the Tewksbury Library. By the way, I'll tell you, if you don't mind listening, I couldn't be a member of the union. By the way, I was a card-carrying member of the union. And when the job was over, I got a letter in the mail with all my dues money back, and I was erased from the union. But I was underage operating the elevator. So I'll tell you this story. Now I want to be an elevator operator, but I don't want to be in a sleazy building. I want to be in a nice building downtown. So I go to 71 Broadway, the United States Steel building, and it's like March. And I look for the building manager, and I find his office, and I go in, and the guy's nice to me, and he says, oh, David, he said, we have 6 slots for summer jobs to, relieve the vacation people. He says, and you got to know, Dave, he said, they all go to offices of the company. He said, they all have teenage kids, that want to be an elevator operator. He says, I'll take your name and number, but I wouldn't bank on it. So along about the middle of May, my phone rings, I'm studying, and my mother says, it's for you, David. And I go to the phone, and it's Mr. Mativia. Never forget his name. He said, David, he said, a very strange thing happened. We have an opening. would you like to be the elevator operator at the United States Steel Building? I said, oh, yeah. Yeah. And guess what? I'm 18. And so I go to work. I had a uniform. It's a completely automatic elevator. I don't even know what you need an operator, but they had operators in those days. And there were 10 elevators, 5 local, 5 express. And I'll tell you one story. I learned a bit of lesson, okay? 2 lessons I'll tell you about. All these cute girls that have the messenger jobs coming on and off the elevator. And I had won 2 tickets to the Aqua Show in Flushing Meadows. Now this is way back in what, 50, 55, 50, 54 back then. And so this cute girl comes on the elevator and I say, hey, I've got 2 tickets to the Aqua Show, would you like to go? And she goes, yeah, I'd love to go. She gets off. A couple hours later, she gets on. Where do you live? Staten Island. I said, geez, oh my God. I live in Brooklyn. To get to pick this girl up, I gotta take a train. I got to take the ferry. I got to take a bus to her house. I don't have a car. Then on the way back, it's like 1 in the morning, and I've got the last ferry going back, and it's just me and some guy who's trying to pick me up. And I'm saying, why? You got to ask where they live first. That was that lesson. That was that lesson. And Charlotte learned a lesson. I'll tell you about it. And she doesn't know what I'm going to say right now. When I told the military I was going to take my regular Army commission, I was told you could go anywhere in the world you want. Oh my God. I lived in 70 Powell Street, the 4-room apartment. I had hot water, no shower, no bath. Where the hell do I want to go? Rhode Island? So I sit down with Charlotte and her roommate, both very attractive young ladies. And we're just dating, and I'm going to graduate soon, and she's not done with school yet. So we're not thinking marriage. So I say, I don't know where to go. And her roommate is from the Panama Canal Zone. And she says, oh, Dave, you want to pick Panama. I know a lot of career officers because her parents live in the Canal Zone. She goes, you'll spend 30 years in the Army and never get to Panama. They have golf, tennis, boating, fishing. I'm saying, whoa, I could do this. So Charlotte says, yeah. And then when the summertime comes, Lynn will be down there. And I'm looking at these 2 pretty girls, one of whom is going to be in Panama in the summer, and I pick it. And guess what? When I end up going to Panama 1 year later, Charlotte is Mrs. Lieutenant David Hanrahan. And she's gone with me after she picked the place. We ended up with both children being born down there, and it's not easy. It's not easy for pregnant women in the tropics. But it was interesting. And when I got to do that legal work, it gave me more time to be home. But there was one point where I was in the jungle for 2 weeks and out for 2 weeks and in for 2 weeks and out. And by the way, when I got promoted to captain, I was only 26, but I looked like a kid. And when I got introduced to men, they were like this. Captain Hanrahan. I looked like I just got done with the Eagle Scouts. But the parachute badge and the jungle warfare patch said something. So, but I want to make a point, as long as I'm talking about it. The thing that was obvious to me is, and when we send our men and women, now women, to war, guess what? It's a 26-year-old captain, maybe a 25-year-old captain. It's a whole bunch of young men, 18, 19. It's a bunch of kids. And so we've got to really think twice. And I don't want to make political speeches before we send these young people off to these terrible places. And I know we have to balance things, but I can tell you, if any of you are veterans, you know what I'm talking about. It's young people in the Army that do the bulk of the work and the fighting. Anyway, if there's any further questions. And by the way, if any one of you ever think you want to start writing, do it. And you may not want to write murder mysteries because they're hard. You got to keep remembering what happened before. You know, you don't want somebody to say, wait a minute, on page 20 you said this, and on page 10 you said that. So I'm always reviewing and checking out. And by the way, Charlotte and I started watching Air Disasters. Has anybody seen that program? Don't. okay? If you ever want to take trips in an airplane, you don't want to watch air disasters. They take major air disasters, and they take them apart. They have the NTSB investigation right in your living room, okay? And you get to see how the plane crashed, why the plane crashed, all that kind of stuff. Well, in fracking, I got an airplane crash. And the NTSB is hard at work. You never know what's going to happen. You just never know. But I do like that underwater fight scene. And by the way, the plane crashes in Long Island Sound, having just taken off from LaGuardia, right outside of Glen Cove. Anybody familiar with Long Island? The plane didn't get very far. I don't want to tell you who's on the plane because that's telling too much. I feel bad it's going to take a while before it's out. So I used to look ahead at various deadlines, and I don't use the phrase deadlines anymore at my age. The word dead is not good. And so Charlotte keeps saying, when are you going to get done? What's your deadline for this? Well, it's not a deadline. So I'm waiting. And by the way, even when this was scheduled for August 19th, I think we scheduled this, a year ago, 7 months ago? It's been a while. And you watch that date coming. And I told Charlotte, I said, Charlotte, anything happens to me, call Bob Hughes. I have a list of people who I'm scheduled to do things with. So, but I'll tell you, being 83 is a funny thing. My son and I used to take my daughter and my son from time to time on trips when I was taking depositions in California, San Francisco. And I was in San Francisco, and I was with my son. And by the way, what a difference when I'm traveling with my daughter and traveling with my son. My daughter takes me to the museums, the nice places. My son takes me to the bars. So I said, Dave, why don't we play golf at Pebble Beach? And he says, that's a good idea. And we're in the room, and I hear him talking to somebody in, where the heck is it? I'm having one of these senior moments. Pebble Beach is in California, which is not too far from San Francisco. So I hear him say, oh, it's a small room, and he hangs up. I said, wait a minute. What are you talking about, it's a small room? Call that number back. So I pick up the phone, and I said, how small is the room? If I sit up, does my head hit the ceiling? She goes, oh, heavens no. I said, we'll take it. I said, Dave, we're trying to save money here. So here's the story. We show up at Pebble Beach, and the guy in the pro shop says, Mr. Hanrahan, we have two twosomes you might play with. One is a lady pro and a friend, and the other is an elderly couple. My son goes, we'll take the elderly couple. I said, what are you doing that for? He said, we don't play good enough to play with Lady Pro. I said, we'll get tips. We'll learn how to hit the damn thing. You know, I said, we're going to be with these two old farts. They were 70-something. So now when I go to the golf course and somebody's being signed up with me, the first thing I think is, oh, geez, they're playing with an 83-year-old. Oh, my God. Anyway, that's it. We got to lock up the place.
Yep, so people can look at the books and sign.
Okay. All right. Let me take a drink. If anybody would.